My name is Gosia Ksionek. I'm Ruby developer in Davanda, and today I want to tell you what can you do when out of the blue you will find yourself in the situation when you need to use two separate databases in one Ruby on Rails application. Some time ago, I found myself in such situation. My boss was informed by our admin that our database is growing really fast and we will soon run out of the space disk. And we obviously need to do something about it. So the decision was made to separate one app database into two different ones and move certain models into this new database. Obviously, one of the requirements were that it should be as quick as possible because database is growing. We are facing a problem with running out of the disk space, and it also should require as minimal amount of workforce as possible because we had a huge backlog of tickets. We need to do them fast, so you can imagine that it should be done ASAP. So I began working on this task with rather thorough research on how we use this data. And what I discovered, or what I already knew, was that we use this data in one module of our application. It's connected to the rest of the app with only one foreign key, and all the changes on data are made via active record. So that was the starting point. Then, after this research, we had three solutions on the table that we considered. First solution was to extract the data and all the logic behind it into the microservice. But this solution was quickly dismissed as the most time-consuming and workforce-consuming, so we decided not to do it. Then we considered moving this data into new database and then accessing it via foreign data wrapper. This solution I will talk about in second part of this presentation. But at that moment, when we were evaluating these solutions, we decided that it may not fulfill all our expectations and it may be overly complicated. The third solution was to connect certain active record models directly into the separate database. It is not a very known method, but it is possible. And there are certain advantages and disadvantages of the solution, and I will discuss all of them in the first part of this talk. So when we decided to use the third solution, what I started with was making a very specific checklist of all the parts of the app that I need to make sure are working before I roll the changes out. And this checklist was my guideline through whole the process. And this is how I structured the first part of the talk. So as I was doing it, exactly in this order. And actually, what was surprising and a very nice surprise for me was that the basic part of this work, so connecting certain models into the second database, took me no longer than 2 or 3 hours, and it was just working. Most of it was just working, but actually going through whole checklist and making sure that everything works took me a little bit longer. So what I started with was making changes in database YAML file. So making sure that in database YAML file that we all know, we have proper entries about this new database. For the purpose of this presentation, let's assume that we have some model called transactions, and these transactions can be differentiated by categories. And these categories you want to store in a separate place. So the secondary database is called categories development or production second DB. So we all know that this database is the secondary one. After adding these entries, I just created a class that was establishing connection directly into this secondary database. And then I needed to make all the models that I want to store in this secondary database to inherit from this base class. And then it was it. This was actually working. We were establishing connection in the base class, and then these models were using data from the secondary DB. Another thing I needed to do was to refactor scopes, because we need to realize if we are using two separate databases, they are actually two separate databases. We have we cannot use any join methods, any SQL queries that require data from these both sources simultaneously. And I was aware that we have this kind of queries somewhere, but I was also aware that it's easy to refactor them, just so they were not using this data from two different sources simultaneously. And I thanked myself for my thorough research beforehand, because I wasn't surprised with that problem, but I was surprised with other problems. Because then I needed to make the tests work, because of course I want to check if these changes are working and if I have any problems. And then it turns out that the specs are not working, and why? So what was the problem? Was the database cleaner, because in Rails we clean database around every spec, and then we need to make sure that the database cleaner is cleaning both databases simultaneously around every spec. So what I do, I just introduced some changes into a spec helper that was there, and they were making sure that they are cleaning up both databases around every test spec, just to make sure that we have the same behavior as we know. And then I need to say that this project that I was working on at that time was quite data heavy, and we have a whole set of seeds, and we are modifying data during development all the time. So we have this habit of nearly daily resetting our database to make sure that everything is working. And then I need to make sure that all the rake tasks that we are using all the time are working exactly as they were. So what I did, I create a rake DB full reset substitute for common rake DB reset task, and it was just the idea was very simple: drop all databases and create two databases instead of just one. And so that actually assure us that we have the same behavior as before. And then another problem that I needed to address was generating migrations, because we doesn't want to we wanted to use common race migration generator, but we need to make sure that it's actually working. So what I did was I found the Rails code responsible for creating migrations. Then I just copied it, make proper adjustments. So it was storing migrations in new folder in a app directory. And then we have proper files that we can migrate into the new database. So, and that was very important. So we had a new folder in the app directory just to make sure that the migrations for the new database are stored separately, so we can migrate them separately, so the data are not mixed up. And then was another problem. So actually migrating the data, because we have proper migration for new database, and then we need to migrate the data. And then I had the same approach as before. So I found a source code responsible for migrations. I copied it into separate rake task, and then made changes. So what it was doing, it was just migrating data, but before and after it was switching the databases. So when we wanted to migrate data for new database, it was switching from primary database into the new database, proceeding with migration, and then it switched back to primary database to make sure that that we have that other migrations won't be affected. And then there were two important parts, but they are strictly dependent on particular app setup. So I will just mention them. One is continuous integration, because of course I need to make sure that during continuous integration process we had a new database created so the test can run smoothly. And then I needed to update the deployment. So, and I had the same approach as before. So I found proper Capistrano code, I copied it into my deployment file, and then I just added a code that was responsible for checking in both classic DB folder and this new DB categories folder if there are new migrations, and then migrating if needed. And the conclusions from this whole process was that I can say it wasn't that hard. I was afeared at the beginning that it will be not possible to do it, but but the basic part was really easy. The whole process was a little bit more complicated, but the main obstacle was actually that it is not a known procedure. It was very difficult to find any resources online. So many solutions I developed by trial and error. But thanks to these preparations and this checklist I had, it was finished in the roughly estimated time, and the migration itself was run without any bigger issues. It was quite smooth, and we didn't notice any bigger problems. So it was also little success, and we avoid running out of the disk space. But since that time, I wondered whether I made a good choice. Wasn't any solution better? Have I decided to dismiss the solution that may work even better for us? So I decided to experiment with foreign data wrapper, the solution that I mentioned on the very beginning and that I dismissed. And what I want to say is I haven't used this on production, but I decided just to experiment to create this presentation and to make sure to find out how it's working. So what is actually foreign data wrapper? It's a foreign data wrapper is a Postgres implementation of SQL standard of management of external systems. It was added to SQL in 2003, and into Postgres, it's available since 2011. Since 2011, it's in a read mode, and since 2013, it's also in a write mode. And there are multiple foreign data wrappers, so we can proxy the data by Postgres from plain files from external databases of different types. So it's very convenient. And if we do it, we treat one of the tables as the proxy, so we can actually use data as if it were in the database. And then we can use full power of SQL queries. But how can we do it on a Rails application? And I can assure you there's no easy solutions. There is a gem called Immigrate, but I believe it's no longer supported because I made a pull request with quick documentation fix, and it's not merged since January. So I believe this gem is abandoned. But this gem may be helpful with managing different environments, or just serve as a good example of how to tackle this problem. So to connect, start with the beginning. How we can do it on a Rails app? We need to create migration, and the upper part of the slide is how I was doing it with Gem, and the lower part of the slide is how it was created using pure SQL. And then with the Gem, it's very easy. We have create foreign connection, and it takes care of all things we need to do. And when we are using SQL, we need to first install the extension, then create a proper connection between these two databases, and then map users between the two databases so they can actually communicate with each other. And then we need to create this foreign table. So this table that will act as a proxy between two databases. And with Immigrate, it's quite easy. We are just defining the name of the table, the server that we are using. But, and that's the biggest disadvantage of this gem. This gem is not allowing us to define any defaults in columns and any, for example, sequential IDs. So, and this is really messing up with active records. So if you really want to create data in the external database, I would recommend using pure SQL, because with this gem it won't be possible. And if you, using pure SQL, it's like I show on the lower part, so we can easily define defaults, serial IDs, and any other stuff that we all know from SQL. What surprised me and confused me a lot in the very beginning was that if you are using external tables, then arrays are a little bit confused as well. So when we ask for first row of this external table, it doesn't show us the attributes as it shows us normally. So we need to ask for them specifically to get the proper data. But that is just some inconvenience, and it's not causing any bigger problems. It's just this little gotcha that surprised me on the very beginning. But now we are coming to the biggest advantage of using foreign data wrapper. So because we can actually use full power of SQL. So we can use joins, we can merge the data as we want. And in this example, the subcategories model was stored in the primary database and categories in this external database. And you can see that we see data from both these tables, even when we are using active record methods. Okay, so in the previous part of talk, I mentioned the problems with tests. And the good news is that using foreign data wrapper, there are no problems with spec helper. The database cleaner works very well. The only thing that we need to care about is having this an additional database for test purposes that have the same schema as the production and development one. And that's it. It's actually the only thing we need to care about. And to sum up, I would say that both of the solutions has their pros and cons. With Active Record Way, the setup is quite complicated. It requires changes in many Rails methods, and it doesn't allow us to use joins. But it works very well with data itself. We can save data into the database without any problems using Active Record, and it just works. So it's very convenient. On the other hand, a foreign data wrapper lets us shape SQL queries as we want, and but the config is also quite complicated, and we need to take care of different environments. But it's also working. And from my personal point of view, I would say that foreign data wrapper shines the most when we need to read data from the external source and do some advanced stuff with it. On the other hand, the Active Record Way is very good to save data from one app, for example, some statistics data or tracking data, and then expose it to the external tools, some analytic tools, and without exposing any core data that we have in database. So I think the most important question is which data we need to store in separate places and why. And I hope that after my presentation, you have a clear overview of difficulties and possibilities that are connected with both of these solutions. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And do you have any questions?
I have a question about migrations. In the first solution, the Active Record solution,
Yes.
when you actually split the databases, please remember that Active Record stores applied migrations in a single table. Did you end up with 2 copies of the table, or did you have that in just the one database?
I think it was in both databases we have a different table about migrations, because what I've done was I was switching to the secondary database before the migration. Then I proceeded with migration, and I was switching back. So I can't say I'm 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that it was stored. That information about migrations were stored in the secondary database.
Any other questions?
Mnie bardzo zastanawia, jak się zachowywały asocjacje relisowe w tych obu przypadkach. Czy można było, czy mówiłaś, że w pierwszym w ogóle nie można połączyć rekordów, tak? A w tym Postgre Data Wrapperze, jak się zachowywały właśnie automatyczne łączenie asocjacji między rekordami z 2 baz i jak na przykład działały constrainty, że nie, tu gdzieś znika foreign key, który był odwoływany przez drugą bazę danych?
W tym pierwszym przypadku tam miałam taką szczęśliwą sytuację, że właściwie większość asocjacji była jakby wewnątrz tego modułu, który przenosiłam, i tylko był jeden foreign key, który łączył jakby tą jedną bazę danych z drugą, i to działało bez większych problemów. Nie pamiętam jak do końca jak było z constrainami, bo to już było pewien czas temu. A jeżeli chodzi o Foreign Data Wrapper, tam po prostu baza danych trzyma wszystkie informacje, i o ile pamiętam, to sprawdzałam asocjacje i to działało bezproblemowo. Ale przyznaję, że jeżeli chodzi o constrainty, to nie sprawdzałam aż tak dokładnie przy Foreign Data Wrapperze.
Okej. No dobra, dzięki.
Dobrze.
Did you have any problem with this solution after you deploy to production, after like 1 or 2 months in production, that at the beginning you didn't see it, but later on you wanted to implement something new and said, oh shit, we cannot do that with this?
It was one problem was that we were always forgetting about that it was in secondary database. So if someone want to do something, we just need to remind ourselves that it's in secondary database. But actually we hadn't touched it very much because it was like ready and we just it was left alone. So, but there weren't any bigger issues with it, or that I know of.
Great, thanks.
Dobrze, to bardzo w takim razie dziękujemy za pytania i dziękujemy Gosi jeszcze raz.
Ja tylko chciałam powiedzieć.